Have you ever eagerly arrived at your parents' house for a long-awaited family trip, only to discover that the only one waiting for you was the family dog? I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but here I am. Maybe I just need to get it off my chest. Maybe I need someone to tell me I'm not crazy for feeling this way. Because last week, I finally saw my family for what they really are. I've always been the responsible one, the one who figures things out, the one who works hard, the one who never asks for anything. Meanwhile, my younger sister Lauren was the golden child. She got the car at 16, the fully paid college tuition, even though she flunked out, and the unwavering support of our parents. I got, well, expectations. But when I walked through that front door, the house was silent. No suitcases by the door. No last-minute packing chaos. No one rushing to greet me. Just Bailey, their golden retriever, wagging his tail like I was the best part of his day. Then my phone rang. My mother's name flashed on the screen. And the second I picked up, my stomach dropped. There they were, Mom, Dad, and Lauren, standing on the deck of a cruise ship, drinks in hand, sun-kissed and carefree. They had left. Without me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg them to explain. No, I did something much better. I made sure they'd never forget this lesson. This is the true story of Maddie, shared on our /true off my chest, where people reveal the deepest betrayals and realizations of their lives. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to Reddit True Vault for more real-life stories you won't believe. I don't even know why I'm writing this. Maybe because I need to let it out. Maybe because, for the first time in my life, I finally understand where I stand in my family. I'm Maddie Hayes. I'm 32, a real estate consultant in Seattle, Washington. I've built a life for myself, a career I'm proud of, and financial stability that I fought for with my own two hands. My family, on the other hand, let's just say their lives have always revolved around one person, and that person has never been me. The Hayes family isn't struggling. Far from it. My parents, Frank and Susan, own a beautiful home in a nice neighborhood, a house that was passed down from my grandfather. Legally, the house is under joint ownership between me and my parents, something my grandfather arranged because he saw me as the most responsible one. But you'd never know that from how my parents treat me. To them, the house is theirs, and I'm just an afterthought, except when it comes time to pay for things. Then there's Lauren, my younger sister. She's 28, but you'd think she was still a teenager with the way my parents dote on her. She's the golden child, the one who gets everything handed to her. A brand new car at 16, a fully paid college education, which she flunked out of, by the way, and endless financial support. Meanwhile, I had to work my ass off for everything. When I needed help, my parents told me, "You're smart, you'll figure it out." But when Lauren needed help, they bent over backward to fix her mistakes. Through all of this, there's only been one constant in my life, Bailey, my parents' golden retriever, but in reality, my only true family member. Bailey has been there through it all. The arguments, the disappointments, the times I left my parents' house feeling like I was nothing. No matter what, Bailey always greets me like I'm the best person in the world. He wags his tail so hard his whole body wiggles, presses his head against me, and follows me around like I'm the only thing that matters. And honestly, sometimes I think I am, to him at least, which is why, when I pulled up to my parents' house that morning, I wasn't expecting much, just the usual indifference. I was wrong. It was worse than indifference. I had taken the day off work, packed my bags, and arrived at exactly the time my mom had told me to. But when I stepped inside the house, something felt off. It was quiet. Too quiet. There were no suitcases by the door. No last-minute packing chaos. No sounds of my dad complaining about forgetting something. Just Bailey, bounding toward me with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging, tongue lolling out in excitement. I bent down to scratch behind his ears, confusion creeping in. Where was everyone? I called out. No answer. I checked the kitchen. No breakfast dishes, no coffee brewing. The living room was spotless, like no one had been there at all. That's when my phone rang. I swiped to answer, barely able to form a greeting before the screen filled with sunshine, blue ocean, and the smiling faces of my parents and sisters standing on the deck of a cruise ship. My heart stopped. Surprise. My mom's voice was bright, cheerful, like this was some kind of fun joke. We're on a cruise. 2 whole weeks in the Caribbean. Behind her, Lauren smirked and sipped a cocktail, sunglasses perched on top of her head. You're kidding, I finally said, my voice eerily calm. Oh, don't be mad, Mom continued, waving her hand dismissively. Lauren found this amazing last-minute deal, But there were only 3 spots left. 3, not 4. Not for me. Lauren leaned in, eyes twinkling with amusement. Don't worry, Maddie. We left you something special. You get to take care of Bailey. And that was it. That was the moment I knew. I had always suspected it. That deep down, I was nothing more than a convenience to them. The responsible one. The one they could rely on. The one they could use. But this was different. This wasn't just favoritism. This wasn't just taking me for granted. This was them not even thinking of me at all. I stood there, my phone burning in my hand, Bailey pressing against my leg as if he could sense something was wrong. And I made a decision. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg them to explain. No, I did something much better. I made sure they'd never forget this lesson. I was never supposed to hear it. I was 9, maybe 10 years old, sitting on the staircase at my grandparents' house, hiding in my usual spot when adults talked about things they thought kids wouldn't understand. That's when I heard my uncle sigh, his voice hushed but heavy. Susan was never the same after Maddie was born. You know why, right? Of course, my aunt whispered back. First, Mom dies the same day Susan gives birth. Then Frank almost dies in that crash trying to get home. I don't blame her for thinking the kid is, well, bad luck. I stopped breathing. Bad luck. That was what I was to them. I pieced it together over the years. My father had been at the hospital, holding me for the first time. When he got the call, his mother had passed away. He panicked, rushed out, and on the way back to my grandparents' house, he got into a bad car accident. He survived, but barely. My mother? She saw it as a sign. A curse. She never outright said it, but I felt it. I felt it every time she looked at me and saw something she resented, something she had to tolerate but could never love. And my father, well, he didn't hate me, but he also didn't love me the way a father should. He was distant, absent, sometimes offering a small kindness, but never warmth. But Lauren? Lauren was the golden child. I remember being 5, watching my mother cradle her in her arms, stroking her hair, kissing her forehead, things she never did with me. Lauren got everything. Every hug, every "I love you," every bit of patience and support. By the time I was 10, it was obvious. Lauren was their pride. I was their obligation. And as we grew older, that gap only widened. At 16, Lauren got a brand new car for her birthday. A sleek, shiny SUV, complete with a ribbon on top. When I turned 16, my mother handed me the classified section of the newspaper and told me to start saving if I wanted a car. Lauren got a fully paid tuition to the college of her choice. I had to fight for scholarships, work late-night shifts, and take out student loans just to keep up. When Lauren flunked out of school and dropped out, my parents sighed and told her, "You'll find your path, sweetie." When I struggled to make ends meet, my mother shook her head and said, "You're smart. You'll figure it out." I did figure it out. I worked my ass off. I built a life for myself without their help. And somehow, even then, they found a way to use me. Because despite never supporting me emotionally, despite treating me like a burden, my mother always knew exactly how to take from me. She had a way of making it seem like I owed her, like it was only natural that I contributed to the family's expenses. It started small, covering groceries when I got my first job at 17, then chipping in for household bills when I was in college. Then it became expected. Suddenly, I was the one paying for maintenance on the house, for repairs, for property taxes. Every time something needed to be covered, my mother would sigh dramatically and say, "Maddie, honey, could you help out? It's just this once." But it was never just once. And the worst part? The house wasn't even fully theirs. Legally, it was jointly owned by them and me. Thanks to my grandfather, who must have known deep down that I'd be the only one responsible enough to take care of it. But did that give me any say in how things were run? Did that mean I had a room that was truly mine? A space where I was valued? No, because in my parents' eyes, the house was theirs, and I was just a guest who happened to foot the bills. And I let them. I let them use me, because deep down, I think I still wanted to believe that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself enough, maybe, just maybe, they'd finally see me as part of the family. But standing in that empty house, watching my parents and Lauren laugh on a cruise ship without me, it finally hit me. I had been paying property taxes on a house where I wasn't even considered part of the family. I had been funding a home for people who didn't even think twice about abandoning me. I had spent 10 years handing over my money, hoping it would buy me a place in a family that never wanted me in the first place. And I was done. I wasn't going to be their backup plan. I wasn't going to be their financial safety net. I wasn't going to be their invisible daughter anymore. I sat on the couch, Bailey curled up beside me, his head resting on my lap. His warm, Steady breaths were the only thing grounding me as my mind raced. For my entire life, I had been the responsible one. The one who cleaned up the messes, the one who sacrificed, the one who was supposed to just take whatever was thrown at me. And I had, over and over again. But sitting there, running my fingers through Bailey's fur, a bitter thought surfaced. Even a dog is treated better than I am. Bailey was loved. He was cherished. He had a place where he belonged. No one ever forgot about him. No one ever left him behind. I couldn't say the same for myself, and that's when it truly clicked. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg them to see me. No, I was going to hit them where it hurt the most, their wallets. The next morning, I walked into a real estate attorney's office for the first time in my life. For once, I wasn't there as the responsible daughter, the fixer, the one who was supposed to keep the peace. I was there as someone who wasn't going to be taken advantage of anymore. I handed over the folder I had prepared, 10 years worth of property tax payments, maintenance costs, repair bills, and every other expense I had covered for a home where I wasn't even considered part of the family. James, the attorney, flipped through the papers in silence. Page after page of evidence. Proof of how I had been used. How I had let myself be used. When he finally looked up, his expression didn't hold the usual pity or condescension I had come to expect when talking about my family. There was only quiet understanding. I already knew what he was going to say before he even opened his mouth. Legally, I had every right to demand repayment for my financial contributions. If my parents refused, I could take them to court and force them to either pay me back or sell the house to cover the debt. It was so simple, so logical, and yet it felt monumental. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one being backed into a corner. They had already made their choice. Now, I was making mine. I spent the next few hours combing through my records, making sure every single transaction was accounted for. Every tax payment, every home repair, every single time my mother had sighed and said, "Maddie, just this once, okay?" I added it all up. The number on my screen made my stomach turn. $117,000. That was how much I had spent on a house where I wasn't even considered family. That was how much I had given to people who hadn't even thought twice about abandoning me. I didn't hesitate. I drafted the email. Subject: regarding my financial contributions to the house. Mom, Dad, I hope you're enjoying your trip. I've taken the past few days to go through my financial records and tally up all the payments I've made toward the house over the last decade. Attached, you'll find a detailed breakdown of these contributions, including property taxes, maintenance costs, and various repairs, all of which I have paid for in full. The total amount comes to $117,000. Since this is a jointly owned property, I have the legal right to demand repayment for my share of these expenses. Therefore, I am formally requesting reimbursement for this amount. If you choose to ignore this request, I will have no choice but to pursue legal action, which may result in the forced sale of the house to cover the debt. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. Maddie. I read over the email one last time. Then, without hesitation, I hit send. I didn't expect an immediate response. After all, my parents were busy living their best lives on a luxury cruise, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change. But when they did open that email, it was going to ruin their vacation. I knew the exact moment they had opened my email. It wasn't because they called me. No, they never confronted things head-on like that. It was the silence. The eerie, stretched-out silence where normally my mother would have been sending passive-aggressive texts or my father would have left some vague voicemail about how disappointed he was. Instead, nothing. For 2 weeks. Then, they came home, and I was waiting. I was sitting in the kitchen, sipping my coffee, Bailey lying at my feet, when I heard the car pull up. For a brief moment, I let myself imagine a different version of this moment. One where they walked through the door, remorseful, ashamed, finally seeing me as more than just an afterthought. One where my mother's first words weren't laced with anger, and my father actually looked at me like his daughter instead of some stranger. But that wasn't the world I lived in. The front door opened, the sound of suitcases being dragged across the floor. Then, silence. I didn't have to turn around to know what was happening. They had seen it. The envelope on the kitchen counter. The letterhead stamped with my lawyer's name. The cold, hard numbers staring back at them. The $117,000 price tag on a decade of being used. The rustling of paper. Then, a sharp intake of breath. And finally, the explosion. My mother's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. There was the sound of the letter hitting the counter. Then footsteps. Quick, angry. I didn't rush to meet them. I turned around slowly, sipping my coffee, watching as my mother stormed toward me. her face flushed with barely contained rage. My father lingered behind her, gripping the letter like it had personally offended him. She was already speaking, her words tumbling out in a fury. Something about how this was their home, how I was being ridiculous, how she couldn't believe I would do this to my own family. It was almost funny. They had abandoned me without a second thought, but the second I put a price tag on it, suddenly, I was the villain. I let her go on, let her spit out all the usual guilt-tripping nonsense. Then, when she finally stopped to take a breath, I set my mug down and tilted my head. Did they even realize what they had done? Did they actually believe this was normal? But no. They knew. They just never thought I would push back. I took a slow breath and finally spoke. I asked if they even remembered me when they were boarding that cruise ship. If, for even a second, they thought about me standing in an empty house while they toasted their departure with overpriced cocktails. My father tensed, shifting uncomfortably. My mother didn't answer, and I think that was my answer. I leaned back in my chair, watching them. I told them the truth, that they only remembered I existed when they needed something. Money. A responsible adult to handle the things Lauren was too spoiled to deal with. But when it came to something fun, something that actually mattered, I wasn't even an afterthought. I let that hang in the air. Let them sit with it. And then, quietly, my father asked the question I had been waiting for. Was I really doing this? I didn't hesitate. I told him I wasn't suing my family. I was suing the people who had used me for 10 years and then left me behind. My mother let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head like I was being dramatic. Like I was making something out of nothing. And maybe that would have worked before. Maybe I would have doubted myself. Maybe I would have backed down. But not this time. This time, I asked her something she wasn't expecting. I asked her why. Why she hated me. Why I was never enough. Why she could love Lauren so easily, so freely. But I was always a burden. For the first time since they walked in, she faltered. She scoffed. Said I was being ridiculous. That I knew that wasn't true. I didn't let her run from it. I told her I knew the truth. I knew about Grandma dying the day I was born. I knew about my father's car accident. I knew she saw me as a curse before I even had the chance to prove otherwise. I told her I had spent my entire life trying to prove otherwise. I told her I had spent my entire life paying for it. And then I asked her the question she couldn't answer. How was a newborn baby supposed to be responsible for any of that? She just stood there, silent. And for the first time, she looked small. Like she wasn't the immovable force she had always pretended to be. Like she was just lost. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Instead, I turned to my father. I told him exactly what I wanted, what they owed me. If they could pay it, fine. If they couldn't, then the house would be sold. And that was it. No more guilt. No more expectations. No more taking care of people who had never taken care of me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to figure it out. This time, that was their problem. I watched them carefully. For the first time in my life, they weren't watching me back. My mother's eyes darted to the side, refusing to meet mine. Her lips pressed so tightly together they had lost all color. My father, always the quieter one, stood stiffly by the counter, shoulders tense, gripping the letter like it might somehow change if he just held onto it long enough. Lauren, standing a few steps behind them, had tears in her eyes, but I felt nothing. Not guilt, not sympathy, not even anger anymore. I had given them the truth. I had laid it all out, stripped bare of all pretense, all the fake warmth, all the unspoken expectations. And now, I was giving them a choice. I told them I wasn't expecting them to pay me back overnight. I wasn't some heartless debt collector banging on their door, demanding money they didn't have. But if they wanted me to let this go, if they wanted me to walk away and pretend none of this had ever happened, they had to do something in return. They had to change. They had to acknowledge what they had done to me. They had to stop treating me like I was nothing more than their personal safety net. Because if they didn't, if they continued to act like I was just a convenient bank account, something they could use and discard whenever it suited them, then I would take them to court, and they would lose everything. I expected an immediate explosion, another furious outburst from my mother, another attempt to guilt-trip me into submission. Instead, there was silence, not the dismissive kind. Not the kind that carried the usual "oh, Maddie, don't be so dramatic" undertones. This was different. This was the first time I had ever seen them truly caught off guard. Because I had never done this before. I had never been the one with the power. And I think, for the first time, my mother felt small. She clenched her jaw so tightly I thought she might break her own teeth. Then, slowly, her fingers curled into fists, and her lips parted just enough for the words to slip out. "You think you can make us beg?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. My father stiffened at her words. Lauren wiped at her tears, silent. But I only exhaled slowly, shaking my head. I don't want anyone to beg, I said, my voice calm, even. I want respect. I want fairness. But most of all, I want you to finally admit what you've done. She scoffed, turning away slightly, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But she still wouldn't look at me. She couldn't, because she knew I was right. I shifted my gaze to my father instead. And you? I asked, quieter now. Do you have anything to say? He swallowed hard, still gripping the letter, still standing so stiffly it looked like he might shatter under his own weight. And then, finally, his fingers loosened. His shoulders dropped. His entire frame seemed to sag under the weight of something invisible but crushing. Regret, guilt, shame. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. He didn't finish his sentence. But he didn't have to. For the first time in my life, I saw it. I saw it. He knew. He had always known that all these years, my mother had treated me like an outcast, like a mistake that had ruined her life before it even started. That she had never once looked at me with the love and warmth she so effortlessly gave Lauren. And that he had let it happen. He had stood by, silent, while I grew up feeling like a stranger in my own home. My mother's breath hitched slightly beside him, but I kept my eyes on my father. I let him sit in that silence. I let him feel the weight of everything. Then, softly, I spoke. This is your only chance. He looked up, and for the first time, he truly met my gaze. I'm not asking for love, I continued. I'm not even asking for an apology. I just want to be treated like a human being. I just want to stop being the only one who sacrifices while the rest of you live your lives without a second thought. Another pause. Another breath. But if that's too much, if fairness, if basic decency is too much to ask for, then be ready to lose everything. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything I had ever said to them before. My father dropped his gaze first. His grip loosened on the letter, and for the first time since I had confronted them, he looked like he might break. My mother? She was still standing stiffly, refusing to crumble, refusing to accept that she was no longer in control. But she wasn't speaking. She wasn't fighting back, because deep down, she knew she had already lost. For the first time in my life, I had control, not just over my finances, not just over my future, but over them, and they knew it. That realization settled over the house like a thick, suffocating fog. No one dared to challenge me anymore. No more snide remarks. No more passive-aggressive digs. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't leave right away. I could have. Maybe I should have. But something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity, wondering if they would actually change now that they had no choice. Maybe it was resentment, forcing them to sit with the weight of their actions instead of letting them brush it under the rug. Or maybe, deep down, I just wanted to see them squirm. Whatever the reason, I stayed. And Bailey never left my side. He followed me everywhere, his golden fur a constant presence at my heels. At night, he curled up at the foot of my bed instead of in my parents' room. When I moved through the house, he moved with me, like he had chosen his side, like he understood that the balance of power had shifted. And in a way, it had. For the first time, this house actually felt like mine. Not in a legal sense, not yet, but in a way that mattered more. For the first time, I wasn't just a visitor in my own family's home. I watched them carefully. Lauren avoided me at first. She sulked in her room, probably waiting for things to blow over, for my parents to find a way to sweep everything under the rug and go back to how things used to be. Because my father, the same man who had spent years ignoring the problem, pretending everything was fine, finally cracked. He started seeking me out. In small ways at first. A question here, a comment there. Neutral topics, safe conversations. But then, one evening, as I was making tea, he finally said it. I should have stood up for you more. I didn't respond at first. I just let the words sit between us, waiting to see if he would continue or if he would retreat like he always did. But he didn't stop. He admitted that he had seen the favoritism, that he had known my mother treated me differently, that he had let it happen because it was easier than fighting. And for the first time in his life, he apologized, not in the way my mother would have, not as a manipulation tactic, not as a way to guilt me into backing down. It was quiet, heavy, real, and it didn't fix everything, but it was something. Lauren, on the other hand, wasn't ready to accept reality. She was still clinging to the idea that she was the victim in all of this, that she was the one suffering because her easy, cushioned life had suddenly been interrupted. But even she had changed, just a little. She wasn't being coddled anymore. My parents weren't rushing to shield her from consequences. For the first time in her life, she had to deal with reality. And then there was my mother, who had spent years making me feel like an outsider. My mother, who had refused to look me in the eye when I finally confronted her. She didn't apologize. She didn't even try. But something was different. She wasn't barking orders at me. She wasn't demanding that I drop the lawsuit, because she knew she couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, that was her first step toward understanding that I wasn't going to be controlled anymore. I never took them to court, but I gave them a chance. A real one. If they changed, if they truly saw me for the first time, if they finally treated me like an equal instead of an afterthought, I would let it go. But if they ever went back to their old ways, if they ever tried to use me again, I wouldn't hesitate. The next time, there wouldn't be a warning. There would just be consequences. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. The warm air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. Bailey nudged my hand, his tail wagging lazily, his big brown eyes looking up at me like he understood something no one else did. I scratched behind his ears and let out a slow breath. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a guest in my own home, and that was enough. For now, do you think people can really change? Or is this just a temporary act of desperation? Some nights, I catch my father watching me like he's searching for something. Maybe guilt, maybe regret, or maybe he's just trying to figure out how much damage has already been done. He's different now, at least on the surface. He talks to me more, asks how work is going, brings me coffee in the mornings like he's trying to make up for lost time. But I don't know if it's real. I don't know if it's because he actually sees me now, or if he just doesn't want to lose the one person who has always been there, even when they didn't deserve it. And that's the problem with too many years of neglect. Even when people start to change, you don't know if you can trust it. I still don't know if they'll ever truly see me as family. But this time, I make the rules. They don't get to use me. They don't get to discard me when it's convenient. They can either step up, or they can watch me walk away forever. Do you think some relationships are worth saving? Or is it better to cut ties with people who have already shown you who they are? This was Maddie's story, shared on our /True Off My Chest, where people lay bare the rawest truths of their lives. At first, she wrote it to find understanding. But now, she shares it for those who need to hear this. You don't have to keep people in your life just because they're family. Sometimes, walking away isn't the hardest thing. It's the strongest. Subscribe to Reddit True Vault for more real-life stories like this.